Christmas has come early. Today we are talking about our favourite topic, the confluence of nature-friendly farming and extremely right-wing politics. But you'll be pleased to hear it's not me doing the talking today. We're going to look at two articles, one of which seems to be directed principally at the Oxford Real Farming Conference and essentially says there's a few hints of fascism going on, and the whole thing is a little bit racist and possibly partially responsible for the riots in 2024 following the Southport stabbings. And then we're going to have a look at this article written by one of the founders of the conference in response, which essentially says, oh no, it's not. So the background here is that the Oxford Farming Conference has been going on since 1936, so it was very much leading the charge as agriculture became more scientific and mechanised during and after the Second World War. But as we have seen, the unscientific and politically very dodgy organic movement also emerged in this period opposing the modernisation of agriculture. But people at the Oxford Farming Conference didn't really like the muck and mystery approach that the organic movement took, partly because it was fascist, we'll get to that in a minute, but because of this, the organic movement felt that they weren't being taken very seriously, so they set up their own conference, the Oxford Real Farming Conference, which happens at the same time in the same city next door, and it's this conference we're talking about today. This first article was put out by an organisation called Food Rise as part of a project called Seeding Reparations. Their article is concerned with racism, perhaps historical racism, and the need for reparative justice. And they focus on organicism because the history of movements for organic farming are intertwined with the histories of both colonialism and white supremacy. And structural racism still plays out in our own organisations and communities today. Then on the next page, they lump organicism in with the related practices of agroecology and regenerative farming. So this is sweeping, although they emphasise they're not criticising from outside, but are trying to offer a friendly helping hand. Now, I don't think this article is quite as strong as it could be. This is not an entirely uncritical review, but it starts out with a bombshell. A map of the riots in summer 2024 following the Southport stabbings with the subheading Food, the Far Right and Fascism, 1924 to 2024. On the next page, threads connecting 1924's organic evangelists with the riots of 2024. They mention the murder of George Floyd in 2020 and then say, while some pro-organic and other environmental organisations did make statements in support of the UK Black Lives Matter movement that arose after Floyd's murder, the same organisations do not appear to have felt the need to respond to the riots of summer 2024. And yet the same narratives used to fuel people's anger and then ignite them last August were closely entwined with the emergence 100 years ago of pro-organic forms of environmentalism. That's bold, a big statement. Not one I'm sure I'd make myself. I didn't think that the riots were a shadow of the organic movement while they were happening, but I do think that organisations with a dodgy past should be making absolutely sure they're on the right side of history, otherwise people like me might talk about it. The sad truth is that pro-organic and environmental movements, both in the UK and across the global north, have subtly accommodated these tropes over many decades. The article then talks through the history of the organic movement, but they choose to focus on different characters to the ones I did. I like to focus on Lord Lymington because I think he was a significant intellectual driver of the movement, but also bankrolled it. He does get a brief mention. They also talk about Jorian Jenks, who was Oswald Mosley's agriculture man in the British Union of Fascists and a founder of the Soil Assocation. But they make a lot of a chap called H J Massingham, who I have not mentioned before. One of the reasons I have not mentioned H J Massingham is that within the organic movement, they had different approaches to Nazism, and I thought for storytelling purposes, we might as well pick the people with the strongest beliefs. So Rolf Gardner, Lord Lymington's best mate, thought that the Nazis were fantastic. But Lord Lymington thought that the Nazis were fantastic within Germany, but British culture was different, so we would need a different fascism, which he believed was Organicism. But H J Massingham, while he did more or less align with Gardner and Lymington on matters relating to Britain, was not that keen on the Nazis. But the article discusses his belief in blood and soil fascism. Massingham wrote of a displaced populace, uprooted from our homeland and sickening, withering in our urban pot. So this is a desire to undo modernity and return to a natural, healthier peasant society. They tie this to Mosleyite fascism, to which it is related, but most of the organicists thought Oswald Mosley was a bit of a poser. The article then goes on to discuss Albert Howard, who was a disillusioned colonial agricultural scientist who legitimised the organic movement with pseudoscience. Why does the organic movement continue to pay homage to Howard's understanding of the soil while appearing to fail to acknowledge both that his ideas came from Indians and that many of these farmers were often suffering conditions of famine caused by the genocidal policies of the British Raj, of which Howard was a part? Oof. But hold off on the thought of organicists starving people for a little while. This article is correct in that Albert Howard and H J Massingham are tied to racism seen within the organic, agroecological and regenerative movements, because there is racism within those movements, but I'm not sure they articulate it that well. Albert Howard is always quoted saying, "The health of soil, plant, animal and man is one and indivisible," which I looked into the other day, and I think this is a misquotation, but at any rate, this is blood and soil fascism, and it's not true. Unsustainable agriculture can yield healthy whole foods for a short time and enable a balanced diet despite degrading soils, and you could eat a bad diet in a land of perfect farming. Nutrition is important for health, but that is removed from soil. So there is a significant logical flaw in this quote, which really forms the basis of nature-friendly farming. But this hierarchy, soil, plant, animal and man, as articulated in these movements, is racist. Within the soil, they say there is so much life that it cannot be conceived. We don't even know what we don't know. But then we move up to plants, and what do they want? Biodiversity, as we know, is healthy. We need a varied population. And then we move up to animals, and what do they want? Native breeds. We saw this the other day in the Ben Goldsmith video. Can native be defined? I think at this point it becomes irrational. But nevertheless, when you move up to man, what do they want? Anglo-Saxon peasants. Now, I hear many of you clutching your pearls at that. Don't be ridiculous, I've never heard anybody say that. But look closer, it is there. When I had a pop at Groundswell the other week, I got this comment which says that since enclosure, scientific farming, organophosphates, courtesy of Imperial Chemical Industries, spread liberally across the nation by farmers, resulted in the utter destruction of Anglo-Saxon genetics. So enclosure and the destruction of the peasantries, capitalism and science have destroyed the Anglo-Saxon population that nature-friendly farming can restore. But the more astute amongst you will have noticed that the jump from native breed animals, however defined, to Anglo-Saxon people is a bit of a strange one, because Anglo-Saxons are not native to Britain. They were immigrants from what is now Germany. So the organic movement has to justify Anglo-Saxons as natural, which is what H J Massingham tries to do. I managed to pick up this pamphlet that he wrote on pre-Roman Britain for 50p at a charity shop. And it's very interesting because he's talking about the Britons, the native population of this country, who are today the Cornish, Welsh and Scottish. But the point of this pamphlet is to say that those people became corrupted and deserved to be replaced by the Anglo-Saxons. He thinks that when the megalithic people built Stonehenge at the start of the Bronze Age, they were clearly a developing and vibrant, sophisticated culture. And Stonehenge was a great improvement from the earlier monument at Avebury, which shows they were progressing. But he says this beautiful culture was destroyed by the Celts, the Britons of the Late Bronze and Iron Age. The Celtic impression upon Britain is trifling when compared to that of the megalithic. Their mission was primarily a destructive one. Their civilization betrays a relapse into barbarism. So that's H J Massingham. The Anglo-Saxons might not be natural, but we can treat them as such because the Celts were just not very good. The next bit of the article is about the aristocracy and eugenics. Here they diverge a bit from what I would say, talking about a lady called Marna Pease who was influenced by Rudolph Steiner's biodynamic farming, which they say inspired Lord Northbourne to coin the term organic after he removed the mysticism from biodynamic farming. Personally, I think this book, William Sanderson's Statecraft, is the origin of the organic movement in Britain. Rudolph Steiner's biodynamic farming is continental and parallel. It's not entirely unrelated, but it is a bit different. And William Sanderson was also British. I think the article would be strengthened by talking about the feudalist politics found in this book, rather than the fact that Rudolph Steiner was just a bit crazy. But no matter, because they then go on to talk about the British Union of Fascists, who characterised Britain as the New Rome and were very rude about Oriental workers. Then they talk about Jorian Jenks' writings and its links to British fascism, which they tie to the riots following the Southport stabbings. The Soil Association and the Biodynamics Association ignored the far-right narratives that gave fertile ground for Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech to seed a white supremacist discourse that blossomed into the overt racism at the heart of the riots of summer 2024. They correctly say that the Soil Association was designed to be a vehicle to revive fascism after the war, which seems to have worked in the long run. Jenks kept the movement alive during its barren years on the periphery of public life until finally, in the early 1960s, the door began to inch open. Through the Soil Association, these people were able to keep the flame burning just long enough for everyone to forget why we tried so hard to put it out. So that is a summary of the historical argument. I think it's very good to see environmentalists looking critically at their own movements, because that is what I am trying to do. I am an environmentalist who is very concerned about the problems of climate change, but I see many of my fellow travellers get swept up by the stuff this article is addressing. And they are right in that undeniably there were racist origins to these movements, and there are still people in the movements today who believe we must restore the Anglo-Saxon race. But at the same time, I think this is quite a weak line of attack, because the racism within these ideas is irrational. These people want biodiversity of plants for very well-established reasons. Surely diversity within the human population should be promoted for the same reasons. They could also have tossed in misogyny. In their opposition to modernity, the organicist narrative follows that capitalism caused feminism, which causes the destruction of the white race, which we discussed a while ago. But much more importantly is that these people were trying to reduce the food supply to cause a genocide against townspeople and restore the feudal age, which, unlike racism, I think is inherent to the organic ideology. And this still applies today. They are trying to undo the Green Revolution. They don't agree with using artificial fertiliser, even though it supports half of all people alive today. Killing all of these people would be necessary if we were to universalise organic ideas on the land. That's what the concept of organic was designed to do. And on top of that, organic farming isn't even good for the planet because it's inefficient, which generally means more emissions per unit of stuff produced. But I've said those things before. I'm very pleased someone else is coming up with a new angle. At this point, the drama begins. Colin Tudge, who I understand is a founder of the Oxford Real Farming Conference, has written a rebuttal. In a circulatory email sharing his thoughts, he dismisses the article. The historical facts are well known and have been well discussed, and in truth have no particular influence on what organic farmers and growers think or do today. It is a would-be storm in an imaginary teacup. He notes that they set out to show the organic movement is rooted in deeply pernicious ideas from which it cannot escape. He says that the article tells us nothing new because the historian Philip Comfort has covered the history of the movement, but the authors didn't quote him in their text, so without actually saying so, the authors managed to convey the impression that Britain's organic movement has perpetrated some kind of cover-up, and he is offended. I'm not very impressed by that bit. Philip Comfort's work was funded by the Soil Association, which he says was no strings attached, but why would you pay someone to dig skeletons out of your own closet? And there has absolutely been a cover-up of the history of the organic movement, because Lady Eve Balfour is venerated as the only named founder of the Soil Association and the pioneer who started the movement. But that's not true. She wasn't a pioneer. The association was founded by lots of male fascists like Lord Lymington, Rolf Gardner and Jorian Jenks, who were all writing long before Eve Balfour's book came out. And most of Eve Balfour's book was lifted straight out of Look to the Land by Lord Northbourne, which suggests that she didn't come up with the ideas herself. So there has been a cover-up here. They pretend that this progressive woman and Albert Howard created their movement, when in actuality these two were cogs in a much larger fascist political outfit. And I don't think criticising the failure to mention Philip Comfort is reasonable, partly because of his funding, but also because they do mention other historians like R J Moore Collier. And there hasn't been much historical work done on the movement, really. The most comprehensive work on their attempt to install a dictator in 1933 is this one by a German. But anyway, getting into it, Colin Tudge rests his argument on the Wikipedia definition of organicism and then says, by this definition, it isn't obvious that the organic movement should be seen to be organicist at all. And I don't buy this. To say that the organic movement might hypothetically be distinct from organicism is to overlook the fact that it isn't. He then supports this by arguing people believe an organic approach is needed to avoid ecological collapse, which isn't true taken literally. These ideas were not designed to save the planet, and they're certainly not the only option. The pioneers of this movement would have echoed what he says here. They wanted to prevent ecological collapse, so decided to try to kill everyone and go back to the Dark Ages. I don't see that he's managing to draw a particularly strong distinction between his friends and the fascists here. Especially as he then says pre-industrial, peasant farming, if you will, has been around for 10,000 years and has supported a steadily expanding human population through thick and thin, while the industrial kind that depends on agrochemistry has been with us for barely a couple of centuries and has already helped to bring the natural world to within a few decades of collapse. And I don't like that, because it presumes that there is going to be a collapse, which is not a given. We could meet the challenge of climate change if we sharpen our act up a little bit, but these people are so convinced that people will die through ecological collapse that they're prepared to undo the Green Revolution and kill those people ahead of time so that a smaller, more natural, organic population can survive. He then asks why organicism is dreadful, which is an interesting angle. The first reason he addresses is the racism given through Steiner, Jorian Jenks and Albert Howard. He outs himself as a follower of Steiner, which I think is needlessly undermining his own position, but he is quite forthright on this. Many see Steiner's kind of thinking as anti-scientific and therefore nutty and bad. Others see it as at least a useful counter to scientism. You know, those people who have been indoctrinated by science and don't see things as they really are. He then says the problem is Steiner's forays into anthropology, which, as you may imagine, was a bit racist. But our friend defends this by saying that in the 1920s, eugenics was seen to be a respectable science. Anthropology is not really my area, but I think it's fair to say that in the 1920s and 30s, fascism was seen to be an acceptable political creed in some circles, and a lot of fascists quite like eugenics, so I'm not sure this really works as a counter-argument. But then he plays the blinder, and he says, such thinking is surely not essential to Steiner's principal thesis. I think this is valid. I don't think the racism is essential. But that said, just as the racism was irrational and incorrect, so was most of what Steiner believed. If you were to strip away the stuff that's irrational and incorrect from biodynamic farming, you're not left with much at the end. And Tudge then turns to Jorian Jenks and immediately commits a bit of a boo-boo. For someone who is supposedly well-versed in the history of the ideology, he should be avoiding any allusion to depopulation like the plague. But where Jenks claimed that Britain needed to repopulate the land, he says he certainly would not repopulate the land because we need as much wilderness as can be achieved. You could interpret this as more extreme than what Jenks believed, because Jenks wanted peasants on the land, where our friend wants wilderness. And as someone who lives here, I find that a bit threatening. He does, however, agree with Jenks's belief in the small working farmer and does want those people on the land. Perhaps a peasantry, but he denies this. I am not dreaming of some imaginary idealised feudal past, as Jenks seems to have in mind, but of a long-term, viable and agreeable future based on the post-organicist but related concept of agroecology. But again, what is the difference between what Jenks believed and the beliefs of Colin Tudge? Jenks also wanted to create a viable, long-term, agreeable future centred on principles of health and nature. Colin Tudge seems to draw a distinction because he believes he is the good guy, but I'm not sure he's proven that. A little bit further down, he specifies, "We do need to make democracy work," which I think comes across as a bit defensive. We then turn to Albert Howard. The author describes him as an enlightened soul employed by the empire. He discusses Howard's contribution and then asks, did this in Albert seem fascistic? Yes, to the blood and soil point, but that hasn't quite been raised. Instead, the argument drifts to the Indian farmers suffering conditions of widespread famine caused by the genocidal policies of the British Raj. In response, Tudge says he doesn't follow the line of thought, which is probably a fair defence, as Howard wasn't trying to starve peasants. The second line of attack is that the far-right ideas continue to affect the Soil Association after the war. This is absolutely undeniably true because they founded the Soil Association to push their views, and Jenks edited the association's journal until the 1960s. But the specific charge is that it laid fertile ground for Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, and by extension the riots in the summer of 2024. Now, being honest, to me this does seem like a bit of a stretch, but I'm not sure he handles it that well. He seems to sort of defend Powell by clarifying that he meant the River Tiber foaming rather than presumably the Thames or whatever. Personally, I would have just not said that. This is similar to where he asked why organicism is bad. I feel like for his purposes, he should be distancing himself from these ideas. He goes on to explain the murder of George Floyd and the Southport stabbings and the following riots. He emphasises that the local people helped clear up the mess, which I think is funny because it reads like he isn't trying to distance the organic movement from the violence, but rather argue that Britain isn't racist. But then he does make a good point. It may be that the Soil Association made no public statements on these incidents, but then, to my knowledge, neither did the Musicians' Union or the members of the Magic Circle. Silence does not necessarily mean complicity. Tudge then deals with the quote, "The sad truth is that pro-organic and environmental movements, both in the UK and across the global north, have subtly accommodated white supremacist and racist tropes over many decades, and now, backed by insurgent tech oligarchs, they are re-emerging globally." I sort of agree with this quote, but I think it's been articulated quite badly. We are seeing a resurgence of the sort of ideas Lord Lymington had. We're seeing a withdrawal of farm support in favour of nature, a turn away from the spirit of fairness that was the post-war consensus. Worker-owned farms are being attacked by inheritance tax and being undercut by unfair trade deals. It feels like we're heading towards a more Darwinian future on the land and in the wider economy, which is the vision of the tech oligarchs. So in this way, the organic movement laid the rhetorical groundwork for a neoliberal hellscape. But that point is much bigger than the racism, so Tudge throws it out as seemingly inherently daft. And in responding to the first article, I think that is a reasonable response, but I don't think the broader point is inherently daft, especially as Colin Tudge observes in horror that they might rerun the Green Revolution in Africa. So they're not racist. They're not racist. We shouldn't be trying to feed the people in Africa, though. It's gone too far already. But they're not racist. That remark aside, I think he's probably done a half-decent job in defending himself against the racism charge. Did the Oxford Real Farming Conference cause the Southport riots of 2024? Probably not. But I think he was really, really lucky that his challengers chose racism to be the point of contention here. Had they discussed reducing the food supply to shrink the population, which is the bigger point here, he would have been completely screwed. His discussion of the Green Revolution is sinister. The third point he discusses is that the Oxford Real Farming Conference platformed Zac Goldsmith, who is a bit xenophobic. He says Goldsmith was and is a champion of the natural world and argues it was necessary to platform him to get Gove to talk to them. He's then needlessly pernickety and corrects his challengers when they refer to people by the titles they held at the time of writing. Goldsmith wasn't a lord in 2018 and Sadiq Khan wasn't a sir until 1925, which I understand not to be the case. If you're going to nitpick, you have to do it carefully. They then go on to discuss the lack of racial diversity in farming, which is very easy to defend because nowadays it is very hard for anyone who is not rich to get a foothold because land is now treated as a commodity like everything else and has become prohibitively expensive. this is true. He concludes, taken all in all then, this is not the scholarly and revelatory expose of deep and dark undercurrents that the authors claim it is, and which they presumably intended. I think this is probably a fair assessment. It is rather an elaborate exercise in conspiracy theory. That isn't a fair assessment. Neither organic farming nor the related concept of organicism depend on right-wing ideas, and right-wing ideas do not necessarily or usually induce their adherents to farm organically. If you were to impose organic farming methods globally, you suddenly wouldn't be able to support half of the global population, so you would have to decide which ones to kill. This would produce an organic elite and is not egalitarian or progressive. It is inherently right-wing. I think Colin Tudge's response has all of the hallmarks of Lord Limington's ideology. The Green Revolution was a horror. We don't want any more people. We don't want a rerun of the Green Revolution in Africa. I'm not racist though. We hate science, we hate capitalism, we want small cultivators and wilderness. And a little bit of bonus content for you. Helen Browning, who is the current head of the Soil Association, has written a comment on Tudge's article saying, "We have also had many concerns about the approach that the authors have taken, which is sensationalist." And she suggests these far-right ideas are the polar opposite of the agroecological community's intentions. She shares a birthday message sent to association members. It's normal to accentuate the many people we are proud to celebrate. Lady Eve, of course, and Sir Albert Howard, who made some early breakthroughs in understanding our founding principle, that of blood and soil fascism. Jorian Jenks, for instance, an early editor of our Mother Earth journal, was an active member of the British Union of Fascists. The blood and soil narrative that he and others espoused might have initially been seen as a romantic agrarian dream, celebrating healthy peasant life and a back-to-the-land philosophy. The word early is doing a bit of heavy lifting there. He was running the journal for decades. But then Browning says the Soil Association quickly shifted into empathetic and largely apolitical territory. I can see why she would say that, but I heartily reject it. Her organisation was founded to restore feudalism by starving the cities to death, and their ideas, if implemented today, would still have that effect. But they're empaths, they're apolitical, they don't have thoughts. And Helen Browning's distinction between Lady Eve as a good person we are proud to celebrate and Jorian Jenks as a bad person is rewriting history. They were allies, which is why they both founded your organisation. I'm sure there are good people in the Soil Association, but I am not part of an organisation that was designed to preserve fascism into the post-war age, because I have no reason to be in a club like that. It is suspect. Anyway, I extend my thanks to the person who alerted me to those articles. I enjoyed reading them and I hope you enjoyed the episode. I find these ideologies fascinating because these people believe they are the good guys. But that is part of the problem. If you internalise the idea that you are the good guy and you are working for the greater good, then you become willing to inflict suffering on others. That's collateral and it's acceptable because you're the good guy. You become morally unaccountable to yourself. So we must make sure that these people are held accountable to others, and we must stop them. So do subscribe, I'm sure we'll get there in the end. Goodbye.
Never has Britain's soil been more productive than it is today. Hundreds of thousands of idle acres have been brought into cultivation, while old farmlands are yielding more than ever they did. As a direct result of the close partnership between farmer, machine maker, and agricultural engineer, British farming is today more highly organised, more efficient and more mechanised than ever before in its history.